Hello and welcome to today's seminar. Cambridge Central Asia Forum seminar series is the last seminar for this term. We do have the Central Asian New Year celebration on Sunday. So those of you who have signed up are welcome to come. Those of you who haven't signed up,
Let us know.
you can be nice to us and everything. But let me welcome Rachel Kay. She is a PhD student in the University of Cambridge in the Department of Anthropology. She did her MPhil in the Center of Development Studies and took our course on Central Asia and the Caucasus, and I hope that's why she's doing the fieldwork that she's doing and doing the degree that she's doing today. She's going to be talking about the walnut trade in the Kyrgyz Republic. Yes. And it'll be, she has just spent 15 months doing fieldwork in the Kyrgyz Republic, and she's been in the region. She was in Uzbekistan with us last April. So she is going to tell us about what she has found.
Thank you for having me. Let me just share the screen first. Okay. Is that all good?
It's all good, yes.
Yeah, so thank you so much for having me.
Just a quick check on Zoom, people. Can you hear us this time? Somebody give us a sign. Great, William, thank you.
Yes, thank you.
Okay, and tell me also if I need to speak louder. So I came back from fieldwork in December, and I'm still unpacking my data and deciding what to do with it. So very much this presentation is sort of thinking about early reflections on my fieldwork. I'll discuss a bit of my project background, research questions, methodology, and then kind of where I'm thinking about going with writing up. And I'll also share an outline of chapters as they're standing at the moment, which will obviously change at the end. And any feedback is really appreciated. I know that this is an interdisciplinary audience, also people from different professions. So I've tried to make it kind of as broad and accessible to different approaches as possible. And it would be really helpful to know whether this makes sense to you as an interdisciplinary audience, and also whether the chapter outline makes sense as well. So a bit of background first. For my project, I carried out research with people whose working lives are connected to the walnut forests in the mountains of South Kyrgyzstan. These cover around 200,000 hectares, and they're the largest in the world of their kind. They're semi-wild walnut forests, so a mixture of planted, a mixture of naturally occurring, and they're majority walnut trees, but also are highly biodiverse in wild fruit trees. So scientists have understood them to constitute a unique ecosystem and gene pool, and as such, they've been the subject of scientific research and conservation initiatives since the incorporation of the region into the Russian Empire in the 19th century. And also importantly, they're amongst a very small number of forests in Central Asia. So residents who live around these forests make a substantial portion of their income from collecting and selling walnuts. They sell the walnuts to traders. The resulting trade networks stretch across Eurasia, going to various places, including Turkey, Russia, and the Middle East. So it's a huge and really complex trade network, which I very much only was working with people in a part of this region, just for practical purposes of having to kind of cut those networks of trade somewhere. So most of the exports out of Kyrgyzstan are of the kernels rather than the shelled walnuts, because the kernels are about 5 or 10 times more expensive, depending on how they're graded. So the work of cracking the walnuts to extract the kernel is a really important part of the trade. And most of this work is done by families at home and is fitted around other household tasks. And then traders preparing the walnuts for export also have to sort and grade the walnuts into different price categories. And this work is carried out in the traders' warehouses and is done almost exclusively by women. This was actually in this slide. So that's the summary. And now on to my research questions. I started off with a focus on working lives and ecological change in the walnut trade. That was how I went into the research, my research proposal. My central research questions were, what is specific about the experience of trying to make money from walnuts, walnuts that come from a forest embedded in a Central Asian political economy? and how are these experiences affected by the wider Eurasian geopolitical landscape? So kind of thinking through work through three different factors really. And it was clear from my research that all of these things create unpredictability for those seeking to generate economic value from walnuts. And I was particularly interested in how people navigate that unpredictability in their daily lives and daily experiences of work, and how those are shaped by these three things. As time went on during my research, and
okay, that from your mouse, the top blue thing.
oh
Yeah, that's fine, thank you.
So as time went on, and partly because of changes in my methodology, which I'll discuss in a second, I came to think more about the connections between work and the wider conditions of social life, in particular family relationships and gender, and how these both shape and are shaped by the economic relations of the walnut trade. So my method was ethnographic fieldwork, which is a qualitative method. It involved a mixture of semi-structured interviews and building long-term relationships with people by spending time with them. And just briefly to talk about this, the rationale behind building long-term relationships beyond the more formal interview format, which other disciplines will use more of. It allows the researcher to understand more about the research participants' wider lives and remain open to changes in the questions and methodology. And in anthropology, the approach is also that knowledge production is understood as a relational thing. So building long-term relationships allows you to see how your data is coming out of relationships between you and your research participants, rather than it being a question of kind of going and seeing a situation that already exists, just as kind of something separate from you. So in my project, I also participated in people's work where possible, as I was interested in the experience of work, and this included walnut collecting in the forest, cracking walnuts in people's home, and also working with a collective of women who were sorting and grading walnuts for export. So my fieldwork locations, these are the 4 locations of walnut forests in Kyrgyzstan, and I was mainly in Arslan Bob. There are different spellings. Arslan Bob is how the people who live in Arslan Bob, who are Uzbek, say the name of the town and also of the forest. So I was focused in the region of the district of Bazarkorgan in the Jalalabad Oblast of Kyrgyzstan. And I spent 11 months in Arslan Bob, which is the name of the small town next to the forest, as well as the name of the forest. And then I also spent 2 months in, actually, let's move to the next slide. There's a small city at the bottom of the valley called Bazarkorgan, which is an hour's drive from Arslan Bob, and also the location of the largest physical walnut market in the Jalalabad Oblast. Sorry, Oblast means region. And there are wholesale traders who buy from this market, and some of them come from other countries. So I met traders there from Russia, Turkey, Syria, for example, as well as traders who are born elsewhere.
Your thing is coming in between the microphone.
Oh, I'll put it here. Traders who were born elsewhere and had relocated to Kyrgyzstan in order to do trade. And then I also carried out one-off interviews with walnut traders during shorter trips to Andijan and Namangan, which are cities in Uzbekistan. So I don't know if I can show, yeah, like down here, basically, in the Fergana Valley. Just to help get a general sense of the shape of the walnut trade in Uzbekistan as well. So I'll show a few pictures now quickly, just to give a sense of these places and different kinds of work that were involved. So this is a street in Arslan Bob. This is, people move for about a month if the harvest is good to the walnut forest, and set up tents there and kind of have their lives there so that they can collect walnuts. So that's the walnut forest in Arslan Bob. This is the shop of one of the walnut traders. that I worked with. He also ran this collective where women worked sorting walnuts. This is one of the machines that they use to sort out different grades of walnuts, and these are the boxes that are packed for export. I didn't take any pictures of the collective because a lot of women were uncomfortable with having pictures taken of them. This is in Bazar Corgan with the family that I lived with there, cracking walnuts. This is the market in Bazar Corgan. And this is showing a collective from a funding proposal by a business in Jalalabad, which is a city near to Bazar Corgan, where they also have a lot of walnut sorting, just to show the process of these collectives that work for the exporters. Oh yeah, sorry, this is actually back on the methodology for a moment. So I started my research with the intention of spending most of my time with walnut traders. But in Arslan Bob, most of the traders are men and operating from their shop stalls in the street. And that street is also a public space that's mostly dominated by men. So yeah, the context for this, I guess, is in Arslan Bob, there's quite widespread commitment to forms of Islam that create moral pressure for women to stay at home or to stay out of public spaces. Although having said that, individual opinions vary hugely about whether that's right or not. But in general, Arslan Bob is a lot more religious compared to other places in Kyrgyzstan. Though in line with wider trends across Central Asia, commitment to Islam is strengthening, has been strengthening in recent years, and particularly amongst young people. So being on the street talking to men as a woman, even as a foreign researcher, was complicated and sometimes stressful, both for me and for the walnut traders. And whilst the ways that they related to me varied hugely, in general, the difficulty of carrying out research in that environment pushed me to move more towards spending time with women. So that involved sometimes spending time with women in their homes, being a guest, sometimes helping with work, sometimes helping with walnut cracking. And I also worked at this collective of women sorting kernels. And then in the city of Bazar Corgan, it was a really different gender relations, and the traders working from the tables were a mixture of men and women. So in that context, it was much more comfortable for me to work with the traders. So my project ended up kind of being a mixture of working with people doing different kinds of work. And yeah, this is all to say, because of my positionality, I had particular insights, particularly around family relationships and how those are entangled with the economic relations of the walnut trade, and that will probably be an important part of my analysis, and I'll talk a bit more about that later on. So I wanted to give a very short history of relationships between the walnut forest and people, which is a really complex history and has to be short here, but my understanding of this is based on secondary sources, historians who've worked with archives, and also interviews with older residents across my field sites, and one scientist from the Kyrgyz Academy of Science, who's both a local and an expert on the forests, and that's the main substance of his scientific work. So before the Russian Empire annexed this area, it was part of the Kokand Khanate, which was a loosely territorialized city-state centered in the Fergana Valley, and governed kind of at a remove. So decisions about how to live with the forest were probably in the hands of local residents, although before the Russian Empire wrote about this, there's no documents. So there's a lot of kind of gaps and silences here in the history. So the Russian Empire annexed the area in 1876 as part of its gradual colonization of Central Asia across the 19th century. And the imperial administration established political control over the area by setting up administrative units. And this was the first time that the forests were managed by a centralized state. There were also explorers who came to the area, Russian explorers who inventoried the natural resources of the forest. And the imperial administration deemed it to be both ecologically and economically valuable. So as a consequence, the administration banned all local economic activities that they saw as damaging to the forest, such as cutting wood. And that had a huge impact on local livelihoods and the relationship between people in the forest. Then with the Soviet era, the state took a much more engaged approach to the management and use of the forests. They were much more intensely involved in it than during the Russian Empire. It had been much more kind of ad hoc expeditions. Whereas under Soviet rule, with collectivization, the forests were incorporated into the Soviet Union's planned economy. Although in this case, with conservation rules in place. So in 1945, the forest was granted the status of a zakaznik, which means a kind of nature reserve where there are restrictions placed on certain kinds of economic activity. So in this case, it was that you weren't able to carry out logging. And in Arslan Bob, the forest, and also across all the walnut forests, they were managed by leshos, which means roughly state forestry enterprise. But the leshos also did a lot more than manage the forest. It covered all of the basic social needs of local people, so schooling, healthcare, social services, and it provided salary employment to at least one person per household. So it was kind of like a total social unit, or tried to be. And it also managed other kinds of land use beyond the walnut forest, categorizing land into 4 distinct areas of how it was intended to be used. So there's the walnut forest, potato farming, which had been introduced earlier in the Soviet period, and then haymaking and cattle grazing. So it was very like segmented approach towards land. And the state approached the forest as an entity to be managed in order to maximize productivity, to fit it into their economic planning, but also as an ecosystem to be conserved, sort of the familiar sense of like it has an innate value. And so sort of a dual approach to the forest, I guess. And there were scientific programs to increase the productivity of the walnut forest through modifying the trees, involving scientists from across the USSR. And then there were also technical experts who came to work for the leshos, also from across the USSR, and locals were also trained to work as specialist employees. So there was a huge amount of human capital investment, as well as physical capital such as tractors, potato storage warehouses, walnut drying equipment. And one research participant who used to work for the leshos as a forest ranger told me that Arslan Bob was the richest leshos in the Soviet Union because of the biodiversity of the area. And so this was kind of a huge source of pride. And yeah, there was also the planting efforts, so to expand the forest area, as well as establishing new tree nurseries and orchards as a way of conserving particular varieties of trees. So in terms of the walnut collecting itself, the state organized people into brigades and set targets for them, depending on the size of the harvest that year. So they tried to predict the harvest. And the leshos then sold the walnuts to other parts of the Soviet Union. But according to my research participants, people who had other jobs would also go whenever they wanted to collect walnuts, and they could then sell them to the leshos, but they'd give you quite a low price for it. So quite a few people would try to hide the nuts and then take them to Andijan, which is a city in Uzbekistan, very nearby, only about 2 hours drive from Arslanbob. And they would take them on the bus, and then when the police came to check, they would pay them a bribe, and then they'd be able to sell them in Andijan for a much better price. There was also a very small number of people cracking walnuts and then traveling to other parts of the Soviet Union to sell them as well. So there were some guys who took, in the mid-80s, some walnut kernels to Tashkent, and then they sold them so that they could buy jeans, because jeans were really fashionable at the time. So there's a lot of good stories actually about this, but the main point is that the trade of walnuts was happening during the Soviet time as well, just more informally. And then in the early 90s, the collapse of the USSR meant that the Lesbos lost its state investment. They had to sell everything off for really cheap, all their kind of equipment and stuff. And they also had to massively downsize their employees. And so there was a sense of great loss of material worth and of prestige. And it was still illegal to cut down the trees at that point, but it wasn't really enforced. And so people came from all over to steal kind of the timber, or walnut trees have burrs, which are really valuable if the trees get old, which can be used for like the insides of cars. So people would come and steal those. And basically it was, yeah, a time of a lot of kind of lack of governance, and also because of the economic crisis. Yeah, so this happened up until roughly 1995, when this new land reform project was introduced. It was carried out it was a joint project between Kyrgyzstan State Forest Service and the Swiss Development Corporation, called KIRFOR, and it operated from 1995 until 2012. And the project was really quite opposed to the Soviet governance approach and saw it as inefficient and top-down. And it originally attempted to develop collaborative forest management approach, but for various reasons this didn't work. And they went through many iterations, but finally the outcome was that individuals would lease land from the leshoz. The leshoz was still managing the forests, but then they'd have a leasehold of 49 years, and they were kind of seen as responsible for looking after the land. And yeah, it's technically true in that the lease is in one person's name, but it's a bit misleading as to how the land is actually used in practice, because extended families will collect tons of the land, even though one person's name is on the lease. And from my fieldwork, there were lots of other ways of relating to the forest and collecting walnuts that weren't prescribed by the expectations of KIRFOR or codified by the law. So a few years ago, someone wrote a letter to the head imam in Arslanbob saying that the land belongs to God, and so people should be able to collect on the land in general, rather than it being under this kind of ownership or rental scheme. And so the imam, in response to that, announced that in the second month of the harvest, people should open up their land for anyone to go in and collect. And this basically does happen, although it's important to say that in the second month it's much more difficult to collect because the weather's not great. It's in November and there can be snow. So yeah, but some people also, yeah, the distribution of the land was very unequal. People who paid money to the leshoz would often get better land, and some people don't have land at all. And I collected walnuts with some friends who would just collect on other people's land and hope that they won't be spotted. And actually they would do that every year. And we did actually get kicked out, which was quite stressful, but they would generally kind of get away with it and still be able to collect. And then one other thing is that people would call other people to work. So especially people who have land, but over the course of time have moved to different kinds of work. So maybe they were doing business in the cities and they don't really use the land anymore. They would have arrangements where they'd call people to work and then maybe share 50%, give 50% of the walnuts collected to the workers and then keep 50% for themselves. So there are a lot of different ways of relating to the forest and of collecting walnuts. And this, yeah, so this is a picture of the walnut forest now, just to show the fences between the land, and how, yeah, in the Soviet era there weren't any fences. So yeah, I wanted to talk about this history just to show the current shape of the forest now, and how the institution of walnut collecting are very much shaped by these past political economic arrangements. So I'm now going to think about this material through the lens of uncertainty, which is, yeah, it was clear from my fieldwork that trying to make money from walnuts was a very uncertain activity. And this is where I'm at the moment. It doesn't have to be the main lens, or I could approach the data in a really different way. So I'm interested to hear thoughts on this and whether it makes sense as a kind of a direction. There are, at the moment, I'm thinking of 3 different kinds of uncertainty, or 3 different sources of uncertainty in the walnut trade. So the size and quality of the yields, the materiality of the walnuts themselves, and then the price. So starting off with the yields, this is a graph of the records made by the State Forest Service of the annual walnut crop for the whole walnut forest during the period 1932 to 2001. And you can see it's massively variable. So some years hardly anything, some years almost 3,000 tons. And that variation is the result of a really complex tangle of different things. So I was trying to think through this, and I thought, if you try to abstract a walnut tree from its environment, are walnut trees uncertain, kind of inherently? And they do have, scientists understand that they exhibit alternate bearing, which is described as the tendency to have a bigger yield one year and then a small yield the next year. But basically, the walnut tree is almost meaningless if you abstract it from its emplacement in history. And here I'm talking about both human and non-human histories. And it's really the entanglement of walnut trees with other living beings, as well as the forces of weather and climate and geology, which determines what they actually do in reality. And that's what's important to the people that are working with them. So perspective is also really important here. And the question is, for me, is how are the walnuts uncertain from the perspective of people who are trying to generate economic value from them? So the previous section, I highlighted some of the ways that changes in the forest and political economic change are connected. And I want to now add a bit more about how the current political economic conditions result in uncertainty around yields. So firstly, the collapse of the USSR resulted in a different relationship with livestock. During the Soviet era, there was a limit on livestock numbers for conservation reasons in Arslan Bob, and that was lifted when the USSR collapsed. And so people started keeping more livestock due to lack of other income sources. And they grazed their cows and horses in the forest from spring to autumn to save money on paying for food. And then the livestock trample on the new seedlings and prevent the regeneration of the forest. And also, in order to feed livestock, people collect up the leaves at the end of the walnut harvest and use their forest land for making hay in the summer. And both of those mean that there isn't humus in the soil, and so it means that it's harmful to the ecosystem in general. And parts of the walnut forest kind of look a bit more like a park, especially parts close to the town, where a lot of the livestock are grazing. So yeah, another thing, so that the result of that is that the forest is aging, and there's very little regeneration. And the Leshoz mapped all of the trees in the forest during the Soviet era and recorded their ages, and those maps still exist. They have 4 classifications for the ages of trees, and 30 years ago, 40% of trees were in the oldest class, and now it's 60%. So it's about both uncertainty and loss as well. And then the final thing is that climate change is resulting in more extreme winter and summer temperatures, and that means that poor harvests are more likely. And some of my research participants, especially traders who've worked with walnuts for over 20 years, have noticed a worsening in the quality of walnuts, including more pest infestations and the walnuts getting smaller. So yeah, importantly, making money from walnuts is much more essential to locals than it was in the Soviet era when people had other salaried jobs. And now nearly everyone collects and almost everyone cracks walnuts when the harvest is good. So the unpredictability of the harvest has a different significance for people now because of political economic change and the connected changes in livelihood. But at the same time, the unpredictability of the walnut yields are themselves influenced by political economy. So the forest isn't this kind of static or separate thing from human histories. And at the moment, I'm thinking about how there's a kind of iterative relationship between political economy and the forests. So thinking now about the materiality of walnuts themselves, once they've been collected. I've been thinking about how the material characteristics of the walnut shape the possibilities of the trade. So one thing is that walnuts have a shell, and the shell conceals the kernel, and the kernel is the main source of economic value. The state of the kernel is usually unclear until the walnut is cracked, and kernels can rot, they can shrivel, dry, change color, and be eaten by pests. And all of these processes alter or destroy their economic value. So essentially, when the walnut's whole, it's really hard to know what its economic value actually is. And even when it's being cracked, sometimes mistakes can be made about what the state of the kernel is. And then another source of ambiguity is how easy it will be to crack the walnut and extract the kernel whole, because the whole kernels fetch the highest price. And so that's another key part of the value. And that's not totally opaque because walnut collectors and traders have ways of sort of almost knowing whether the walnut is easily crackable or not. But there's still kind of room for making mistakes. And it's also about like learning, and people who've just started the trade might not be able to gauge as well as people who've have a lot of experience. So overall, these ambiguities create a lot of openings for both accidental failure and intentional deception amongst traders, and they frequently lead to bankruptcies. So for traders, that creates a real need for trusted business relationships as well as friends and family who can extend credit when bankruptcies happen. So yeah, from this, I'm thinking about how the material nature of walnuts creates a need for certain kinds of social relationships amongst traders and in their wider networks of family and friends. And so now thinking about prices and price uncertainty, the demand for walnuts is tied up with border regimes, geopolitical conditions, and how walnuts are produced in other countries. And all of these are unpredictable in that they might change in the future. And in some cases, they're also unknowable in the present for my research participants, because it's to do with kind of distant things happening in distant places. And so these past and present geopolitical projects shape the flows of goods and the networks of people involved in the walnut trade in what I understood to be non-linear ways. And so in order to understand the trade, I think we need to have a kind of layered approach to time. There's a lot of different things going on that could be explored, but I'll draw out a couple of things here. One is that Turkey is now the biggest player in the walnut trade in the sense that the largest volume of exports go to Turkey. They go overland in lorries, and that's a relatively new thing in the long history of the walnut trade. My research participants told me that Turks started coming to Kyrgyzstan in the early 2000s, and we can trace this at least partly to efforts by Turkey at the state level to forge trading relationships with the Central Asian countries following the breakup of the Soviet Union, sort of based on various things, partly just the fact that the breakup of the Soviet Union made those countries accessible, partly ideas of pan-Turkism. There's been a lot of variation over the years in terms of actual policies, but That has included introducing visa-free entry for Turks to Kyrgyzstan. But since Uzbekistan's change of leadership in 2016, Uzbekistan has become Turkey's main focus for trade partnerships, including trade agreements with walnuts, and that has resulted in fewer Turkish clients buying from Kyrgyzstan, and that's brought the walnut price down. So there's this kind of, constant change in the flows of goods and the possibilities. And then, so one important thing for the price is that the kernels, when they go to Turkey, often they're checked to meet EU food safety regulations, and then they're rebranded as Turkish walnuts and sent to EU countries, because Kyrgyzstan doesn't have the conditions for food safety certification. And so most of the possible value added is exported out of Kyrgyzstan, and that makes the price lower. So that's an important kind of part of how one reason why making money from walnuts isn't sufficient for a lot of people's livelihoods. Then talking a bit about how the Soviet legacy materialized in the walnut trade. One important dynamic is that because of the EA-EU, walnuts can be exported duty-free to Russia, and also because of the shorter distances, smaller amounts of walnuts can be exported to Russia than to China. So the exporters to Turkey are usually quite big companies, and often inaccessible to most of the people that I was working with. So they would sell to those companies, but not actually be involved in the export. Most of the people that I was working with were exporting to Russia in smaller amounts. And another thing that's important here is because of the history of connectivity across the Soviet space, a lot of Central Asians go to work in Russia and have become Russian citizens, or they can be available to participate in trade networks. So a lot of people were sending to friends and relatives in Russia. I might skip this part about, it's interesting actually, but I think okay. So, and then people were telling me that Tajiks have a monopoly on walnut trading in Russia because they have a long history of being involved in the trade of dried fruit and nuts that goes back much beyond the Soviet time. And then another factor that people mentioned was also that the civil war in Tajikistan meant that a lot of Tajiks moved to Russia, have now become citizens there. So geopolitical shifts can bring risk of bankruptcy for walnut traders. And for example, when I was in Bazarkogan in November last year, the US put further sanctions on Russia and the ruble dropped. And that meant that demand fell because buyers no longer wanted to sell to Russia. So that caused a lot of problems. It also, because a lot of the trade works through credit, it meant that there was kind of chains of unpaid credit and people weren't able to work because they were waiting to be paid back. So it's important to situate these kinds of work within a wider landscape of work and work possibilities, especially because most people involved in the trade in various ways that I've outlined also do other kinds of work, which in itself is important because it shows how walnuts aren't enough to make a living for most people. And that's partly because of political economy, partly because of the seasonality. So working with walnuts was part of a livelihood strategy that included other kinds of work. And across both my field sites since the breakup of the USSR and the accompanying loss of formal employment and the collapse of local industry, agriculture and trade have come to constitute the main local possibilities for work. And at the same time, the loss of the Soviet physical and human capital investment has meant that working with the land has become an insufficient means for maintaining socially acceptable material lives. And then, especially in Bazarkogan, because the city centres around a huge bazaar, a lot of people work in trade, but and you can make good money in trade, but it's also really risky. So people talked about kind of trade as our only option. And it's risky, but we have to do it because there isn't much other local work. So yeah, beyond the walnut trade, it's also important to see how the other possibilities of work are made inherently uncertain because of the unpredictability of harvests and the constantly shifting conditions of international trade. So that scarcity and variability of work means that labour migration is for many people the best chance to secure a decent income. And that's mostly men, sometimes women if they're divorced or if they're going with their husbands. But yeah, in Arslan Bob, it was very kind of, it changed completely the social feeling of the place because about roughly spring, around 70% of the men would migrate and then they'd come back around autumn. So yeah, and that migration is usually to Russia or to bigger urban centres in Kyrgyzstan. And so this all kind of requires an approach to work where people have various income earning strategies, and importantly, that they're able to respond to change. So I've gone through a bit how uncertainty in the walnut trade is created by the interrelationship of political economy, ecological change, and geopolitical conditions. And I now want to talk about how all of this is crucially shaped by family relationships and gendered expectations around work. I'm primarily thinking about this through women's life paths and work possibilities, and how these are shifting with economic and religious change. And I want to frame this within the quite intense socioeconomic change that's happening in my field sites. In particular, people that I was working with have experienced increases in material wealth, both in recent years and across generations. And that's specific in how it's locally experienced, but it's also reflective of wider transformations across Kyrgyzstan and its Central Asian neighbours. And generational differences are really important here and felt very deeply. So for older generations, the shifts are framed in relations to memories of radically different relationships with money and with consumption during the final decades of the Soviet era. And then also in relation to the hardship of the economic crisis of the 90s. Whereas for young people, those memories are secondhand. And of the various impacts of that economic transformation, I want to focus on how for many of the women in my fieldwork, changes in material lives were most sharply felt in changing standards of consumption around domestic living, and where the inability to maintain a certain lifestyle has become a source of shame and social judgment. So this all has stakes in how people work and to what ends people engage with different kinds of work. And yeah, so this leads me on to talking a bit about women's work and life paths. And what I would say here is a really simplified account, and it's actually, there's a lot of variation and contestation. But at the same time, the expectations around, like the norms around this and expectation around this are really powerfully felt. So in both my field sites and also in many places across Uzbekistan, Uzbek women move into their husband's house when they get married, and then they're generally expected to carry out most of the household work under the supervision of their mother-in-law, until or unless they move out with their husband and children. So if they marry the youngest son, they generally have to stay, but if they marry an older son, they usually move out, and that's dependent on their family's ability to build a new house for them, which is a massively expensive project. So those dynamics really kind of feed into what people work for. And daughters-in-law in the situation where they're still living with their in-laws, they're often told to have patience, an expression which captures their limited ability to determine their life paths at that point. Women who've moved out usually have more freedom to earn money and decide what kinds of work they want to do. but they still tend to stay locally with their children whilst their husbands emigrate. So they're more within this local economy, which is characterized by uncertain work. And so they feel the uncertainty and volatility of the walnut trade more keenly than the men. And all this is to say that women's life stage really affects their relationship with and access to money and work. So as I discussed, commitments to forms of Islam that seek to keep women out of public space are strengthening, but at the same time, increasing wealth and pressures to consume mean that women are increasingly less willing to accept a lack of access to money. And people told me that due to this desire to live better, there were more women doing paid work now than there had been in the Soviet time. Very different to compare because the sort of landscapes of work were so different. But yeah, I want to argue that these shifting expectations around how women should live and work are fundamentally shaping the walnut trade. And one example of this is the fact that the work of sorting is done by women in warehouses where they're removed from the public gaze. And that's the case across all the different locations where I spoke to walnut traders. So in Asanbol, Bazar Korban, Jalalabad, also in Namangan and Jajon. So in this case, the moral pressure for women to stay out of public space and also the general scarcity of work combined with the desire of women to earn more money for themselves will mean that there's a big female workforce available to sort kernels at a low wage, and that enables the traders to export kernels, and that kind of creates the economic relationships of the walnut trade. So through exploring those dynamics, I'm thinking about building an argument that economic change is throwing into question what it means to be a woman in this context, but at the same time, gendered expectations are themselves shaping the economic possibilities of the walnut trade. So finally, the chapter outline is basically involves things I've talked about already. So chapter 1, and yeah, as I say, very likely to change as I write and interested to hear thoughts on whether it makes sense. Chapter 1 is on how political, economic and ecological change have made walnuts into unpredictable economic objects in particular ways now, and then situating that in the local and regional histories of political and economic change, and in the wider landscape of work. Chapter 2 is on how the materiality of walnuts matter to social and economic relations in the walnut trade. And here I'm thinking about what walnuts are and what they do fundamentally creates the conditions of possibility for the kinds of relationships that constitute the walnut trade. Chapter 3 on price volatility and the geopolitical conditions of the walnut trade, how particularly drawing out how this affects my differently positioned research participants and how the consequences of thinking through sort of the uncertainty covered in both chapters 1, 2, and 3 as well, how those uncertainties are differentiated across axes of gender, economic inequality, livelihood, and location. And then chapter 4, what I was talking about relating to socioeconomic change and how changing standards of consumption and relationships with money are changing how and why people work. And then chapter 5 is about the entanglement of gendered expectations of work with women's life paths changing and that all affecting the relationships of the walnut trade. So that's all. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much, Rachel. That was really very nice to hear. The story it's I think there's a story there. I think we need to flesh it out a little bit.
Yeah.
All right, I'll open the floor for Q&A. We'll start in the last person and
Yeah.
we go on to Zoom. Zoom audience, please use your raise hand button and we ask you to unmute when you're ready. There is a hand already up on Zoom, but is there anybody who wants to like to say anything? Please. Oh, you can. No, that's fine.
Well, thank you very much. I think that was really fascinating. But I was just interested in whether, on the ecological side of things, whether people actually, whilst they acknowledge changes in the quality of the walnuts and so forth, whether they actually link that with climate change.
Yeah,
They do.
yeah, people do in general. It's quite, the consequences of climate change are quite obvious there.
Yeah.
In especially things like much less snow in the winter. And so there's not really the contestation that there is in, for example, the UK or the US about climate change.
It's a contrast with my field site where there was, people talked a lot about changes in the weather, but they just wouldn't make the connection with.
Yeah, I mean, there is definitely uncertainty as to sort of, is this change in the weather to do with climate change, or some things are more clear than others, I think, but there isn't really that same kind of, maybe climate change isn't a thing that's happening. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Beatrice, I think you asked the question first in chat, so please go ahead and unmute yourself.
Are you talking to me?
Yeah.
Yes. So thank you for this presentation. Is fascinating. I have a couple of questions. The first one is about the connection between the walnut forest and the shrine at Aslan Bob. So I'm familiar with the research of Jennifer Webster, who worked on the shrine, and she argues that there is an organic relation between the shrine and the forest. The forest is planted by the saint. So I was wondering how this plays into the Islamic discourse that you have encountered, whether it plays a role at all, or whether there is a downplaying of the shrine in favor of more, how can I put it, more Salafi interpretations. And also in relation to this, is this something that is brought up to claim that the forest belongs to God and therefore to everybody? And Jennifer Webster was also finding that the presence of tourists and pilgrims has an effect on the local economy. I was wondering, because of community-based tourism, I was wondering how this combined with the forest and the collection of walnuts as a source of income. This first question is about the shrine. The second question is about the leasehold and rights, and also how rights are not just formalized but also felt, interpreted by your subjects. So in the Tsarist period, there is a very clear distinction between rights on the soil and rights on the forest. Okay, so collecting walnuts is a right on the forest, while grazing animals and haymaking is a right on the floor of the forest, and therefore one can argue that the two can be separate. Okay, so I was wondering whether this separation, which arguably is there historically, is still something that people refer to. Do they distinguish between, our rights on the trees and what comes down from the trees and what is beneath the trees, if it makes sense? Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much. Really interesting questions. So the first is about, are you thinking of the shrine to Arslan Bob and whether how that relates to discourses, Islamic discourses? Yeah, there are different myths, I guess, around how the forests came to be. One is that they were planted by Arslan Bob, who is sort of understood to be the founder of the town. It feels like, in general, pilgrimage to sacred sites is really contested now because people are understanding that it's not in the Quran. And so there's a sort of, depending on who you talk to, different relationships around pilgrimage. I mean, for example, there is a holy lake that is behind Arslan Bob, which used to be a site of pilgrimage, and now is nobody uses it in this way anymore. They go there for just recreation because, yeah, you're not meant to go to make sites holy, if that makes sense. So that's my sense of how generally people are thinking about holy sites. Yeah, I'm not sure. It didn't come up loads, the connection between the shrine, or I just didn't ask those questions about the shrine and the forests. So yeah, it's definitely one for me to think about. I often wasn't necessarily asking questions about Islam directly. So those things came up more when people mentioned them to me of their own accord. The second question, what was the second question before rights? I didn't write it down.
About the lease.
So there's the rights on the soil versus the rights to the forest. Or was there another question before that?
It's yes, soil versus trees.
Yeah, okay. I'd imagine there was a third question. Yeah, this is a really interesting framing. People didn't talk about rights to me in that framing of we have the rights to this land or to this soil or these trees. And I never really asked about rights. So yeah, I'm not sure about the answer to that question. I can maybe think it through.
You mentioned that how people were writing letters and saying that they have rights. So it did come up in some context.
Yeah, but that wasn't about soil or trees, that was about the forest in general,
From
forest.
the Soviet perspective, because in the Soviet times, they were allowed to do it.
There was a commons, yeah,
And
whereas
after the
it's
Soviet-
now being reframed as kind of Islamic commons. But in terms of the distinction between grazing and the trees themselves, I'm not sure. So thank you. I'll try to think that through the material I have, but also wasn't something that came up directly. Yeah, thank you so much. Really interesting questions.
Did you?
Somebody else?
Sheila, did you want to?
Yeah. Thank you, Rachel. This was such a fascinating presentation. I was wondering, you showed this photo of these people who were sorting the walnuts. Are they women mostly? Are there men participating as well? What is the social dynamic there? Do they form like a support community? Quite interesting to know.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, so they're all women who are sorting the walnuts. The warehouses are owned or rented by the traders who in Arslan Bob were all men, but as I said, in the city were a mixture. So a mixture of men and women. Yeah, the collective that I worked for in Arslan Bob, I was there for 2 harvests. The first harvest in 2023 was massive. And this collective was created by one of the walnut traders in response to that, so that he could export kernels. And then the year after, the harvest was really quite small, and the collective disappeared. And that was like there was a real sense of loss that social group had disappeared, and also, a way of making money. And they also socialized together. They went to someone's land in the walnut forest, and made food. And so it was definitely kind of social group that formed from the harvest being really good. So that's something that I'm thinking about, is how kind of the social relations are also affected by the harvest. Thank you.
Marianne, would you like to unmute yourself?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes.
Good. Very interesting. Thank you very much. And it's really great to reflect so many perspectives of the society through the walnuts. I have a question regarding the phyto and phytosanitary rules. As the country is concerned, Tajikistan is a member of World Trade Organization, and therefore it is included in that networks of rules and regulation, which include also regarding sanitary and phytosanitary issues. But why is it not applied in the country? I'm a bit astonished. You mentioned about the exports to Turkey and lower prices because they couldn't fulfill the conditions.
Yeah, this is a really good question, and is also something that I was hoping to spend more time researching. But I can only speak to conversations that I had with a couple of companies that were exporting, and they said there aren't the conditions in Kyrgyzstan to get the certification that we need. So one company had got that certification from a Ukrainian company, another one had got it from a Swiss company. And yeah, so this is beyond that. I'm not sure why, what the kind of restrictions are or blockages are in that. And it would be really important to know, I think, for understanding why this is, why is basically most of the walnuts are going to Turkey and then getting the certification there.
I can answer that question for you, Marianne. It's a question which we are heavily invested in across Central Asia, actually. So there aren't any labs at all in Kyrgyzstan which can provide certification. So for certification, you need laboratory testing, and there is none.
Yes.
So since and in fact, across the region there are none. So historically, Kyrgyz or other produce would go to Turkey or Russia, get certified and go on from there into other supply chains. So
that should be.
It's not simple. It's not as trivial. They all used to be there in Soviet days under the GOS standard and organized, but they have disappeared comprehensively across the region. And we have studied this since 2014. So we can have a separate conversation. And it's not just in walnut or food, it's across all products other than oil.
Yes, can I say something more?
Okay, go ahead.
Yeah, a very good answer. But this is a project which I would like to join, because resources should be available from outside any source, financial source, from the Gulf or from Europe or any place, because this is very important, so they get paid fair prices for their products.
Yeah, I know it's very romantic in the commercial world to think like that, because the big companies would like them to sell cheap products, and they ensure that they get the lowest value at the low. So it'll be great to do that, but that's a separate discussion to be had. And for 33 years, no, it has gone in the other direction. It has been, more or less destroyed, that capability, rather than built particularly by the Western or global commercial interest. So, which in this case is acted out by Turkey and others and so on. But this is going to take over Rachel's very different story. So I want to close this discussion now on this. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you, Marianne. Motu, did you have a?
Yeah, since this brought up, I have many things, but I want just on this one. In fact, specifically on this one, Rachel. So interesting, the dynamic of space and religion and work and type of work. So the interesting counter current here. So as the narrative comes across is that the women are not as often now participating in, say, collection or other public facing part of the activity, and they are more in close places where they can do sorting.
Although collection is actually fine because people are so far away from each other.
It is that okay, yeah. but what I really mean, going to slightly different direction where this discussion started. So sorting increases the value of the. You're getting the best fat. You're taking out the bad ones, but the good ones, and selling the good ones, which will give you a higher price. So it's like a early stage of testing or certification process. So the fact that this is potentially creating a space in which women can, at the higher value end of the story, rather than the public facing, which is the bulk and it's economy of scale out there, here it starts to graduate towards a more high value add. Is that something that's been thought through? And a tangential but related point is that it did, because of historical discussion you had, how well located Walnut is within the cultural context of beyond just religion, or because we heard religion, we heard about pan-Turkism, we heard about the borders, the many other sort of ghosts in the background, but within that is, does one has a grounding feature in which different sets of people locate their interest. I'm here referring to Kali's work on caviar, how it's done in Caspian versus here. Is Walnut have any such properties?
In terms of generally how people think about walnuts.
Yes, yeah. Is there something there?
Yeah. So first question.
First, more of a comment.
Yeah, I mean, that doesn't feel like it affects the actual experience of work or the pay. So it's value add for someone else, but
Yes.
yeah. And then second question, yeah, definitely walnuts as cures for sort of like a medical cure perspective, and then also just general health. This was something that people talked about loads. I mean, people actually don't eat walnuts loads because they're mostly selling them. And there was a question about tourism that I forgot. That was the one I was trying to remember, I think, from Beatrice. But yeah, there were people who run the community-based tourism talked about how tourists complained that there weren't any walnuts on the table and why there are no walnuts on the breakfast table. And then people would say, oh, we sell them, we don't really eat them that much. But yeah, so the kind of the economic value, I think, of walnuts, and maybe also the Soviet history of not really being, it was more geared towards selling by the lessors rather than people keeping them in their houses because there were these restrictions around being able to bring walnuts home. So yeah, but at the same time, definitely part of recipes and culture of cooking. But people would also talk about how this was much more in other places, like in Georgia, people use walnuts much more in cooking. Yeah, so the things going on there to do with kind of their value as yeah, for the body, I suppose. Yeah.
All right, Kirill, would you like to unmute yourself?
You want to
Yeah. Yeah, a couple of things. Also, I want to start with a small comment that the moment the issues with like it wasn't certification, I think in your presentation came up, it was something else that you mentioned, but the moment when you mentioned that, I kind of immediately thought about Montus. So I was really not surprised when the discussion just happened now. I mean, yeah, but what I wanted to ask is two things, and one of them is very close, which is I immediately started thinking or trying to understand, and maybe it's also something I missed at the very beginning because I joined slightly late, and that is retail chain or supply chain, and how it relates to the value, essentially value capture, and so then the how much they're able to earn, because I imagine that must have been like I haven't seen many of those details in the presentation, but I'm curious whether you have had some data about how the selling to the wholesaler who would sell to retail essentially changed between after the in the post-Soviet transition, and whether it was changing recently. I mean, you mentioned the Turkish resale, Turkish sellers, and I think when it comes to this, especially cross-border trade, it becomes very interesting because that's also the stuff like certification capabilities can happen at that level, just because of resource pooling as well. If farmers are not able to do that, if they don't have like cooperatives or whatever with certain capabilities, but essentially simplifying, do you see how the market for retail is organized there? Like first downstream from collection. And the second question is, in terms of ecology and the perception of it, you touched upon it a little bit, and I immediately thought, like this thing with snow that you mentioned, that people notice that there is less snow. I think it's something that you immediately recognize when you live in areas that have like snow for some months, and then that period of 3 months gets cut down to half a month. You immediately see, and that gets repeated, you immediately see that something is wrong. And I think here it must be especially important because of the worms and because of the insects that eat, because I mean frost is what kills them. And I guess the climate there, maybe you can talk a little bit about that, but the climate there is that there isn't in winter you only have like fairly light sub-zero temperatures, if I'm correct. It doesn't go like -30, and you only have a few months of that. So like even small amount of climate change must generate like a lot of problems with pests essentially. And maybe maybe there is a little bit more that you can say on that, if that was relevant. Thank you.
Thank you. So the market for retail definitely changed from Soviet time, because of Soviet time, the trade was happening outside of state regulation and also within the Soviet space. And then, yeah, I mean, now, as I said, Turkey is the biggest player in terms of volumes. In terms of how it's organized, I guess you can say there are lots of intermediaries within Kyrgyzstan. The intermediaries eventually sell to usually what is a larger company that exports to Turkey, or if it's Russia, it can be, doesn't have to be a big company. So, yeah, I'm not sure exactly what.
Yeah, if I can clarify, do you know how those intermediaries, like this market, is structured? Is it still big government participation there? Is it a couple of companies, maybe one company with license, or is it, for instance, mostly foreign capital that often also happen?
Yeah, so not really government participation, the intermediaries. So the companies selling to Turkey are often run by Turkish people. I should say that this is secondhand information. I didn't talk to any of those companies just for practical reasons. I kept my research to the traders who were working in the Bazar Kogan market, who were buying and selling in that market, and then the wholesale traders who came to the market. So there's kind of a lot of different things going on. Sometimes it's just one person. There was, for example, trader from Chechnya who was basically just organizing the export of walnuts or kernels himself with a few other helpers. So sometimes it can just be one person, sometimes it's a company. So it's hard to summarize because there are so many different ways that it works, and it depends on the destination country. Also worth saying that a lot of traders trade in other things as well. So it could be pistachios, other kinds of dried fruit. Yeah, many different ways that it is organized, but I can chat more if there are particular details that you're interested in.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you, Rachel. I'm just going to read out the comment on the chat from Juldus. She joined a bit late. Sorry, she's originally from there. So she knows the place as well. When we visited Aslan Bagh, we used to stay with families near the Walnut Forest, and they often mentioned that in September and October, and even children miss school to help their families collect walnuts and kernels. I'd love to connect and chat further, but do you have any comments on this? Did you see that at all while you were there?
Yeah, yeah, a lot of kids did miss school at that time. And also in other contexts, sometimes to help with other kinds of work, they would miss school as well. I don't know what else I have to say with that. that happened.
Okay, so that, you did see that, yeah.
Yeah.
You can, you can say that it's a big contrast with the cotton literature. That's when similar, let's say not the same, but similar things would happen with picking cotton. It's the global hue and cry about it. Versus walnut trade, it's just something that happens on the side.
Yeah. Also, Kirill had another question about ecology.
Yeah, go ahead.
I can answer. So actually more what people were telling me about the problems in increase in worms was to do with the higher summer temperatures, because the worms reproduce more easily when it's hotter. The spring frosts were actually an issue for the walnuts themselves in terms of early frosts kill the buds. So that would happen about every 2 or 3 years. And that was one of the things that was difficult to whether it could be traced to climate change or not, because there's already this kind of irregularity in it. And then, yeah, the snow, what people were noticing was the amount of snow, and also how long, like you were saying. So the temperatures can go down to -20 or so in the winter, but not for any long period of time. But yeah, again, I was there when the climate had changed and the winters were a bit milder. But yeah, the main thing that came up with the worms was actually the summer temperatures.
Got it.
Okay,
Thank you.
Brett, would you like to ask your question?
Yeah, great. Thank you. Such an interesting talk. So thank you very much. I'm coming from a completely different background. I work mostly in biodiversity conservation. I've spent a lot of time in these forests thinking about the species that exist there. And they're quite weird forests because they're semi-natural, so we don't think the walnut's potentially a native species. There's also a bunch of domesticated fruit trees planted into these forests. The forests are likely aging, and as you've mentioned, the regeneration is a real problem. I wondered when you were having conversations with people whether you got a sense of whether people cared about the wild species, and whether they were interested in conserving the landscape, or whether it was very much driven by, collection and making money to sustain their livelihoods.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, it would be really interesting to chat more about that side of things, because most of my understanding comes from talking to people rather than from this scientific side. So yeah, it would be really interesting to know more. But my sense, and also the sense of people who were very invested in conservation, is that most people aren't that interested in it. And so people would say to me, people who were really thinking about biodiversity and conservation were saying, oh, like most people are not really kind of that engaged in these issues. And that was also the sense I got from talking to people. And in conversations where I wasn't asking questions about anything in particular, the forests would sort of disappear a lot. They weren't always that present in what people were thinking about. And they would come up at moments of importance, particular times of year. So yeah, I think there's a few people who are really engaged in thinking about those issues, but it's definitely a minority.
Okay.
Questions going on from that. Was there any sense that the walnut trade itself was damaging the forest, or that the picking of the walnuts maybe quite intensively? I don't know, and maybe the planting of additional trees, whether that itself was, so whether the trade itself was damaging to the forest actually, and the wider.
There was a sense that human presence, people walking around and collecting walnuts, also the fact that people now collect as many walnuts as they can in a lot of places means that there isn't much regeneration, but also just people walking around on the land. So people did talk to me about that as another issue alongside with the cattle grazing. Yeah.
But did people feel a sense of responsibility to kind of deal, you know, I don't know, I mean, as you say, it was an important livelihood, so people would just need to harvest when they could. Because I don't know whether people in general had any kind of feeling of, should we think about how we're doing this or something?
Yeah, again, it was really varied between different people. So some
Yeah.
people would say, oh, the forest is really big, you know, it's fine.
Yeah.
And other people would say, oh, we're noticing how the trees are aging and there's no regeneration, and we need to think about how to plant more trees and how to plant kinds of trees that are resistant to climate change. So it was really just a lot of different orientations, and yeah, I mean, those would sometimes depend on past livelihoods. So for example, one of my research participants was a forest ranger formerly.
Yeah.
And that had really, and he'd also studied in Tashkent in Uzbekistan, and had written a dissertation about developing a new kind of, sort of imagining a possible new kind of walnut tree that would bear fruit more quickly. So you could plant it and then there'd be a shorter delay, which is also one factor in people not being that interested in trying to plant trees, because you have to wait for about 8 or 10 years. I should have said about that actually, but so there's quite a big time delay before actually you can make money from the trees. So yeah, that's another thing. So really whether people were interested or not was also depended on their life histories. And
but the people who were actually making a livelihood, even within that group, who the people who were pretty much dependent on the forest, would they be making those?
Yeah, so amongst the traders, also because they'd been working with the walnuts, and especially if they'd been working with the walnuts for more than 20 years or so, they'd really noticed changes. So they were more thinking about what needs to be done.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay. William. Yes.
Thank you very much for presentation. Immensely interesting. A couple of things. Did I get something wrong at the beginning that you almost walked into this with the scope, not recognizing that the market part of it was totally male? Because it almost sounded as if you sort of walked into it and then thought, oh, sugar, and then needed to move towards a female emphasis. Maybe me. And then the second one was, you've highlighted a very interesting approach by women to fit in around the sensitivity of Islam and invisibility, to actually make a creative answer where their values matter, their position matters, and it doesn't upset, you know, the established order. It fits in within it. I've seen things in other parts in Afghanistan where women were banished and they got videos and learned English from Pakistan, or certainly in Uzbekistan, you know, women were definitely, when you met them in public, you say they don't like to be photographed as groups when they're out. But it's this idea that women can actually live within an Islamic culture and actually make a benefit or create an opportunity out of the sensitivities within the culture. Is there something generalizable in what you are looking at the minute? If that makes sense.
Was that generalizable about the way that women are relating to being visible and or being photographed?
No, I think it's generalizable in an economic sense.
Right.
The photographing part was something personal, where I met people and asked to take a photograph in a restaurant, and they said no because their husbands were away and they didn't want them to be seen being out enjoying themselves. That was that particular anecdote. But no, generalizable in the academic sense. Is there other issues in this that you can actually apply to other situations with equal validity?
You do stopping anthropology for a second, go back to the studies and
Yeah. Yeah, so Thank you. Yeah, so with the male traders, I'd been to other places in Kyrgyzstan where it's more of a mixture, or even maybe more women trading, like for example in the markets in Bishkek. And I did know that Arslan Bob was much more religious and more conservative, and people have told me that, you know, there's fewer women on the streets. But I hadn't actually really thought about how that would feel, or hadn't kind of been able to imagine how that would feel to talk to these. And I also didn't know that the traders would all be men. Yeah, so I had, I guess, some sense of how it would be, but not exactly how that would play out in relationally. And it's important to say also this change has happened really quite recently, quickly, and yeah, in terms of the strengthening of religion. Then generalizing, yeah, I think definitely because these kinds of Islam that encourage women to stay out of public space will be less visible, will also in other places probably be in relationship with women thinking about their relationships with work and money. And I mean, one really interesting thing that had happened in Arslan Bob in the last 2 or 3 years was that women had started trading flowers. And that was only really happening in Arslan Bob because in the places around it, there wasn't such a strong pressure for women to stay at home. And trading flowers meant that you could basically do a lot of the work inside your house, because you grow the flowers and then you just have to put them in a taxi so they would do the work on WhatsApp groups of taking orders, and then they put the flowers in a taxi to send to people across Kyrgyzstan. And it was almost all of the women were involved in this in smaller or larger ways. So I think things like that, you might see that happening in other places as well, where there are the same kinds of relationships to work through religion. But I mean, I don't know specifically. I think definitely it would be interesting to see have kind of the conversation between different places where these similar dynamics are playing out.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Thank you. If nobody else has questions, I think I want to jump in, but I want to take the conversation somewhere else. To help imagine your dissertation.
Yeah,
You know,
that would be
this
great.
is what I like to do, so I'm going to jump in with that. So just a few thoughts. I think, and I don't know, I think when you talked about the chapters, what was missing was I think there needs to be a proper big chapter on the Soviet period and the Walnut trade if we have information on that in that period. And
Okay.
then we need to bring that into the post-Soviet comparison, because otherwise it's just a conversation about a small place in a small country, in a sense which is disconnected with the rest of the landscape. So we can talk about geopolitics, but we really need to know what that means, right? So either you can go the political economy route, which is it's a microeconomy which used to be part of a macroeconomy which was connected, and these are the stories that now we see in the post-Soviet period, which are either different or similar to what they used to be, but they have a much bigger role to play in the way other things are happening in society, whether it's gender, whether it's religion, so on and so forth, because that has been now displaced, and they don't have the normal roots that they had connections with, right? So because Kyrgyzstan was Islamic before, it is Islamic now. It was Islamic before in a different way, but it was still Islamic. So in that sense, you know, so I think there should be a chapter on gender, but I think you need to be careful about that chapter on gender, because then what's the unique story that you're going to tell?
Yeah.
Is not the Islamic story, it's something else.
It's a sense, that's William's question.
Exactly. So it is about it's about the region, and and I think Monty was right. It's like what does Walnut mean? The materiality of Walnut itself. for society, whether it's in economics, whether it's in the culture, whether it's in religion, whether whatever. In South Asia, for example, dry fruits play a huge role at certain points in the culture,
Calendar, in a sense.
in the calendar, but not otherwise. So how does that kind of so really the focus has to be the stories, but then you have to sort of pull back and say, okay, what are we looking at? The things I think you could talk about, which you may have seen or may not have seen, I'm not sure, but resilience, right? So the walnut trade has been resilient in a sense. Is that now being threatened because of geopolitics? Because really speaking, it's small traders going to Russia and trading. So the problem is not the trade, the problem is they want to make more money, right, from China and from other places. So the problem is that they are not being able to certify things to sell to EU because they want to make money, because they want to buy more things. The trade was always there, so the small trade is still going to go on with Russia, for example. Does that make sense? And actually the sanctions on Russia are a problem, and they have an impact on Kyrgyzstan, which nobody has imagined, hopefully, geopolitically. So it's those relationships which would be interesting in terms of political economy. So the chapter on geopolitics is about the place of a microeconomy, which is actually not in Russia, which is being affected by what's happening in Russia. So just like what is happening in Turkey and what's happening in China has an impact on what's happening in Kyrgyzstan, what's happening in Russia has an impact on Kyrgyzstan, but not because of the Russians necessarily. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah?
Yeah.
So in a sense, resilience is an important concept to sort of think about, because
It's a trade-off between uncertainty and how they manage that, and that's resilience.
Yeah.
So,
Resilient. Are you thinking of resilience over the long period
Yes.
of across the Soviet
yes,
time?
like
and
different
all that?
strategies that they have used. Are they thinking about that now? Are the younger people, are they only thinking about one way of making money, which is being part of the global economy, which is part of, let's sell to as many people as we possibly can, as in big people, big players.
I said something small. I mean, that you said several times, the ability to respond.
Yeah.
That's what resilience.
Yeah.
That's what we mean.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So there is different frames of how you can try to see what the stories they're telling you, what lens you could use to imagine the story they're telling you. As an anthropologist, that we want to know what is happening there. The wider story is going to be told by other people. You need to tell their story, their voice, and how they imagine it. So you should bring in how they imagine, whether they want to sell to Russia or they want to sell to China or Turkey or whatever. But then you need to pull back and analyze that and say, well, what they think is going to happen is this, right? They think they're going to be able to do this, but actually certification is going to be a problem. This is going to be a problem. Global prices are going to be a problem. So those are different lenses to think about, if that makes sense. We can talk about it later as
that
well,
makes sense.
But these are things that I thought we could use. Gender is important and religion is important, but I don't think it should be the entire focus of how you analyze the information that you collected, because you should be thinking about the walnut trade. I think that's the more fun part, I think, or more interesting.
Okay. Yeah.
And how that does change gender relations and how that changes how that has changed because of religion is another story. But really speaking, it's the economics of it which has an impact, as opposed to, so are they able to sell or not? Are they able to go out and do something or not? So gender is important to say that the sorting is done by women and the selling is done by men. But it needs to be the light of sort of, or the lens of the Soviet, post-Soviet needs to come in. The idea of a Soviet political economy, which is now an independent Kyrgyz political economy, needs to make sense. You need to be able to make that, this is what was going on then, they were part of this network, now they're not part of that network. And with the stuff that is going on in Central Asia, where they are trying to connect different spaces across the countries, through different cooperative organizations, not just EAU, but other stuff as well. They are trying to create these nodes where Uzbek things can go to Tajikistan, or Tajik things can come to Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan and so on and so forth. So the idea of a regional economy is actually coming
Actually,
to
today is a landmark day. They just.
Yeah, they did
The
something.
Kyrgyz,
Yeah,
yeah,
so-
not something very big thing.
Yes.
Kyrgyz and Tajik have signed, delineated the border completely and that
But
agreement was
the
signed.
regional economy is something that you can think about. Again, as a resilient strategy, that would be the way to go. If you're not allowed to certify, and all of those other things are happening in the rest of the world, you need to find a different alternative as well. It can't only be a global story.
Yeah, and I don't think it is really a global
Exactly.
story. Yeah.
Yeah.
I have some thoughts, but I can.
Yeah, I mean, we have a few minutes, but, if I, and then we can wrap it up, so go for it, yeah.
Okay, yeah, I mean, I suppose in terms of how to think about the material and whether to think it through the economy as kind of the first, or the regional economy as the lens.
Mhm.
In my material, it does feel like the decisions that people are making are coming a lot from intimate relationships, family relationships, and those, they're coming from that frame. And so how to think that through, it feels like it's sometimes the material is kind of asking me to start from there rather than to start from these larger economic relationships of the walnut trade. So that's sort of why I was thinking it through gender and family relationships as one, but I also haven't decided how to how to deal with that.
No, that's fine. If that's what they're saying, then you need to think about that, but,
Yeah.
yeah.
But I think there is, it's neither, it's not binary that
Yeah,
there are a number of relationships which you commented on are either built or changed or modified by these bigger changes. So in some sense, you have to look at the distributed agency of like, so you want to push located the agency in the person, you are not able to say, well, that is, it could be happening beyond other things. While you see those things, you want to start to weighing them out. So this is the problem, right? This is the traditional anthropology trap. Of this, 15 months of field work, and rightly so, and being there, and those of us which matter most. But they are shaped by a number of things which are not necessarily all. 15 months, okay, other way, let's put it this way. It'll take another 10 years to unpack why they are saying. Where did this stuff come from? Yeah, right?
affected by things before you were there.
So I mean, we can really, spend a lot of time, it's often common to the kids or younger people don't think about the Soviet past. But it doesn't mean it's disappeared somewhere.
Yeah.
Right? So it's there in a number of institutions, it's in materiality, in architecture, in memory of parents and grandparents, or teachers, and so there, and it gets modified. It's presented a different way. Yeah, but we look at that most obvious part of it, like they don't think of Soviet Union as something that they have experience with, but their experience, but their own relationships still are affected by that, and as much as by Islam, like I said, different kinds of Islam, and again, idea of being nomadic cultures and so on. So one of the things I always say is it's really interesting, the idea of the fences and borders you had discussion, right? So sovereignty also is an important aspect of this thing. You talked about the Tajiks, you talked about Russia, you talked about Turkish people, and the idea that Kyrgyz were across this massive space. They probably had the largest expanse of that whole Eurasian landmass. They were traveling, trading, doing things. Now they are shrunk to a very small geography at borders, right? So that plays a role also in how they imagine the past, which is part of the nation building process, which again addresses the land lease issue, that going back to that, changing that. Yes, those are all interconnected things. So the question is, we need to pick the ones where you connect your voices to. So that's where that chapter would be useful.
Yeah, the borders of the land and of the countries.
Yeah, the three things I wrote down were borders, climate change, heritage.
And climate change and earthquakes and other things which don't know any borders, which come to you uninvited.
Yeah.
All right.
All right, I think that was great. That's a great end to our seminar series for this term. Thank you all for joining. Thank you, special thank you to the Zoom audience, who comes every week, even when we have issues with our audio and other things. So thank you so much. We shall send out the seminar series for Easter term, in May. So see you then, but hopefully see you in between now and then as well. Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much.